I would like to get a question in a little bit off the topic, but isn't it true that Islam flourished in Europe like in the 800s in terms of astronomy and mathematics and medicine? And what happened that declined from that point?
Yeah, it's definitely the case that that was the ninth century, exactly as you said, ninth, 10th centuries were a time of flowering in the sciences for Islam. The center of that was Baghdad, actually, which of course we associate with violence today, but was the heart of sort of the intellectual culture. And then there was a second moment of flowering of sciences and philosophy in Spain, in Muslim Spain. And that a little bit later, especially in the 11th, 12th centuries. But even then, those were, I mean, not everyone would like this because some people really want to build up the sciences in medieval Islam, but those were mostly, how do I put this carefully? They were not universal phenomena. So in other places of the Islamic world, there were scholars who were opposed to the sciences and philosophy. There was always opposition to it. And so they were sort of moments where a scientific culture built up. And as you probably know, a lot of the medieval Latin Christian, Western Christian, the scientific development, I mean, even Thomas Aquinas himself, but others as well, more involved in philosophy and mathematics, depended on the translations of Arabic works into Latin. Yeah.
Well, our numbers are back there, so I'd say we're ready to go again.
Okay, great, terrific. So thank you again. This will be probably the biggest challenge because after lunch is a good time for a nap. So I'll try to keep the energy up and keep things interesting. In fact, this third reflection is on something that really is important to me, which is thinking about the church's relationship with Islam explicitly. And as you might have seen from the advertisement, I framed it as a discussion of the dialogue and proclamation, or dialogue and evangelism. And this won't come as a surprise, but I'm with Pope Francis in saying that we need to do both, that the church is called both to dialogue and to proclamation or evangelism. So most of this talk will be working up just to that basic point. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Do you need to start the recording, Deacon John? You already did. Okay, super. All right. Let me move this out of the way so I can get to presentation mode. Okay, and Deacon John, that's showing up okay for you? Okay, great. All right, so as I mentioned, I framed this as a question. I've already given you the answer to the question, which is yes, dialogue and proclamation. As usual, I will address this topic in 4 headings or subtopics. First, I'd like to introduce the notions of community for Catholics and Muslims, that is the church and what Muslims know as the Ummah, which is the word for the Islamic community. And then I'd like to introduce something that you probably already know and know better than I do, but nevertheless, the new evangelization and how that emerges from the Second Vatican Council and the thought of Pope Paul VI, but of course, very enthusiastically embraced by John Paul II, and then also emphasized by Pope Benedict and Pope Francis. And then I'd like to spend some time speaking about something I addressed just briefly in the previous talk, which is Islamic evangelism or evangelization. And the Arabic word for that is dawah. So I'll speak about dawah and give you some resources to learn a little bit more. And then finally speak about dialogue and proclamation. The talk will end with a couple of examples of saints, or maybe soon to be saints, who manifested a disposition of charity towards Islam and maybe are exemplary for us. So I thought that would be fitting, especially it's November, we had the Feast of All Saints just recently, and we'll ask how they can help us move forward in the church's relationship with Islam. Okay, so a good place to start is just to think about the church. With my students, this won't be a very revolutionary thought for anyone here, But nevertheless, with my students, it's just important for me to make the point that, listen, Jesus didn't just come to us to perform miracles, suffer, die, and rise again. He did all of that. It was awesome. It was great. But in fact, the witness, the universal witness of the early Christian community, and which is very clear in the Gospels, that he didn't just do that, he also founded a church. So he had a clear vision of how the Christian community would continue his fundamental work of revealing deeper truths about God and spreading the good news of salvation that he's brought to the world. So he had a plan. You know, sometimes, I don't know, sometimes someone moves away or someone retires or someone dies, and people just have to organize, you know, and make something up in order to continue on with the family or the business. This didn't happen with Jesus. He had a plan for what would happen when he was gone. Anyway, you know all that, and I'm probably just boring you with this point, but for my students, that's really important. When I say church, they usually think of a building, specifically the Basilica of the Sacred Heart on Notre Dame's campus, where, by the way, the football team goes to mass, although I promised I wouldn't mention the football game. Now I've done it twice, so much for that promise. All right, so my students usually think of a building, but of course, the church is fundamentally the community of all of the baptized, unified with Christ and with each other in baptism. And it was the will of Christ indicated, among other places, at the Great Commission at the end of Matthew's Gospel, where he commanded the apostles. It wasn't an option. He commanded them to form this community throughout the world, go to the ends of the earth, baptizing people in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So baptism then is central to the identity of the church. In the letter to the Romans, Paul says, "Or don't you know that all of us who were baptized into Christ Jesus were baptized into his death? We were therefore buried with him through baptism into death, in order that just as Christ was raised from the dead through the glory of the Father, we too may live a new life." So, I mean, baptism is a big deal. We have the beautiful tradition of infant baptism, which began with the early church, of course, and it is something, of course, we're grateful for deacons to lend a helping hand and more in baptism. This is the sacrament which defines the church, that brings us in union with one another and with Christ. I just wanted to connect this, however, with the missionary nature of the church. So in the Great Commission, Christ commands the apostles not only to take care of the believers who were already there, but to reach out and spread the good news with the entire world. The Great Commission is a sign for us that the very work of Christ, which was unfolding the deeper knowledge of God, that is something we are commanded, not simply invited, but commanded to participate in. It's not a question of counting numbers, but it's also not a question, it's not an option for the church. As Christians, and by virtue of our baptism, we are called to mission. This is really clear in the Declaration Ad Gentes from Vatican II. I don't think I have any quotations from there. I'm going to skip ahead to a later 1975, I think, declaration of Pope Paul VI. But the church is very clear on this point. And in the next slide, you'll see, I think the American church, but not only the American church, there's generally a lot of work to do in this area. And it begins with our formation of young people and cultivating them a spirit of evangelization. My students at Notre Dame, and you think of Notre Dame maybe as the flagship Catholic university in the United States, in fact, my students generally have a negative association with evangelization. When I say this word and I ask them ask them what comes to their mind, they think of fundamentalist, born-again Protestant preachers who are shoving religion down someone's throat. They don't think of Christ's foundation of the church as a missionary church. Well, excuse me. The quotation I wanted to share here is first from Lumen Gentium, so from Vatican II, not from Ad Gentes, who, and the Council Fathers here emphasize that in the act of Pentecost, of the gift of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost, which is associated with the birth of the church is born in mission mode. When Jesus, who had suffered the death of the cross for mankind, had risen, he appeared as the one constituted as Lord, Christ, and eternal priest, and he poured out on his disciples the Spirit promised by the Father. That's already at this scene in the upper room after the resurrection, but then in that same room manifested at Pentecost. From this source, the church, equipped with the gifts of its founder and faithfully guarding his precepts of charity, humility, and self-sacrifice, receives the mission to proclaim and to spread among all peoples the kingdom of Christ and of God, and to be on earth the initial budding forth of the kingdom. And you can read to the end there. Okay, it's probably clear enough, and I probably don't need to go on much further. I bet I am preaching to the choir. Let me say a couple of things about the Islamic community and how Muslims conceive of their community. It is something in some ways quite similar to the church. Muslims would hold that the Islamic community was not something that was formed by Muslim believers after the death of Muhammad, just thinking about what is the best way to organize their community, but rather was established by God. We have this quotation from the Quran in chapter 3 of the Quran. You are the best community, in the Arabic word there is ummah, that ever emerged for humanity. You advocate what is moral and forbid what is immoral and believe in God. Had the people of scripture, that is Jews and Christians, believed, it would have been better for them. So the ummah is a distinctive community, obedient to God's law, believing in God, which is separate from the Jews and the Christians. The Ummah is different from the church, however, and we've mentioned this point briefly in the first talk, in as much as it is not shaped around individual figures who receive authority from their founder, in the way that the Catholic Church is founded on the apostolic succession of the bishops. There is no central authority in Islam. Shiite Islam, and I promised I'd say a couple of things about this, and this is the moment. Shiite Islam is a little bit different. So let me just say this. You see the word caliph there, which is the second in the list. According to Sunni Islam, when Muhammad died, he had established an ummah, but he had not made a decision on how that ummah should be led. And so the early Muslim leaders of the society, but not religious leaders, came together and chose one man, the companion and friend of Muhammad, whose name was Abu Bakr. And they made him the first caliph. The word caliph means successor. So the first successor to Muhammad. That was a good choice because Abu Bakr had merits, but it was not God's choice. It was not Muhammad's choice. It was the early community's choice. Shiites hold that God did have a choice. He meant for leadership to remain in the family of Muhammad, and he had chosen Muhammad's cousin, whose name was Ali, A-L-I, and he commanded the Muslim community to follow him as the first imam, which Shiites would call imam, I-M-A-M. We're going to see there's two meanings to that word, so it gets a little confusing. Okay, so Sunnis, Caliph Abu Bakr, Shiites, Imam Ali. But they both agree on the principle that God himself formed Muslims to be a ummah. And as we'll see, they agreed on the principle that this ummah was to spread throughout the world. Eventually, in Sunni Islam, the caliph began to have less and less authority, especially after the first 200 years of Islam. The caliph declined in authority. Eventually, the caliphate would be abolished because it was held in the early 20th century, or the seat of the caliphate was in Istanbul in Turkey, and Kemal Mustafa Ataturk, the secular leader of Turkey, would abolish the caliphate in the 1920s. But anyway, long before that, the caliph had become less important. And what replaced the caliph in terms of guiding the community was the class of scholars, I've mentioned this word once before, known as the ulama. So a little bit like the elders or the preachers in evangelical Protestantism, who in an informal fashion interpret religion for evangelical Protestant believers, the ulama interpret Islam and especially explain the precepts of Islamic law for Muslims. Today, there are ulama throughout the Muslim world and through the West who have different degrees of authority based on their personal charisma and sometimes based on their affiliation with the state in which they live. Ulama are different than the imams in your local mosque. So an imam, in the sense of prayer leader, is simply the title for the one who leads prayer. I mentioned imam in a different sense before, which was the Shiite sense of the rightly guided leader established by God himself. The first one was Ali. But in a more general sense, for both Sunnis and Shiites, the word imam is used for a prayer leader. Muslims, whenever they pray, they will have one person pray in front, even if they're at home and it's just a family praying. And whoever is in front is the imam. So it could be the father in the family, for example. Okay, and someone who's an alim or part of the ulama in prayer may or may not be the imam, the prayer leader. Does that make sense? So imam usually is restricted to the question of prayer, even though in American society with American mosques, imams somehow take on a different role, more like American pastors or priests. We could speak more about that. I don't think I was super clear, so I'm happy to get questions to clarify some of those ideas. The most important point is that Muslims have a parallel notion to church, which is ummah. It is not marked by central authority as the Catholic Church is, but it is marked by a missionary impulse. And we're going to see this is going to be important in the way Islam develops later. Okay, but I'd like to speak about sort of evangelism or evangelization on both sides. First, the Christian side, and in particular, the Catholic Christian side, and then the Islamic side. As I mentioned before, that I would refer to Pope Paul VI, Blessed Pope Paul VI. In Evangelii Nuntiandi, his encyclical specifically on proclamation, he writes, the church exists in order to evangelize. That is to say, in order to preach and teach, to be the channel of the gift of grace, to reconcile sinners with God, and to perpetuate Christ's sacrifice in the Mass, which is the memorial of his death and glorious resurrection. It's a beautiful phrase, just beautiful, I think, how he very succinctly summarizes the mission of the church. Church does many other things. I have a kid in Catholic school. I'm very grateful for that. I have, like many others, been stitched up in other things in a Catholic hospital. I work with different Catholic aid organizations, St. Vincent de Paul, other things. That's all great. But the reason for the church's existence is evangelization. This is the inescapable burden put upon her by Christ himself. And of course, the Mass itself is part of evangelization, but it is also preaching and teaching. So that's sort of the good news, the good side of the coin. And now the grim reality of how the church has been doing in this regard, especially, especially in the United States. And this is bad news. There's no easy way to present it, or it's very hard to find a silver lining. The church is in decline in the United States. And you probably have more statistics and data and information on this, but I'll share what I have for my modest research. In 2007, according to the Pew Religious Landscape Survey, which was a really robust study of over 30,000 Americans, and they did it in 2007 and again in 2014. Catholics were 23.9%, so almost 1/4 of the United States self-identified as Catholic. And the nuns, or the unaffiliated, if only that were NUNS, but the unaffiliated were 16.7%. In 2014, in 7 years, that declined by over 3%. Catholics had become 20%, and the nuns raised by over 6%, 22.8%. And so as of 2014, and there is every reason to believe that now in 2020, things are worse and not better. And again, this is sort of a pastoral question, and I have no business getting involved, but I can only imagine that with the pandemic, that has accelerated the process of people leaving the church, and unfortunately, many maybe not returning. According to Pew, ex-Catholics in 2014, again, that number may be higher now, in 2014 were 13% of the American population. That is just a stunning number. It makes it, after Catholics, of course, it's not a denomination, so it's foolish to speak that way. But anyway, after Catholics, the second largest denomination or group, religious group in the United States are ex-Catholics. So, you know, I listen to EWTN radio, and I listened to that show, Coming Home, or is that it, with Marcus Grande or something like that. And you, in other shows, a lot of the apologists and things there are converts to the Catholic faith. And you can listen to that stuff and feel like, oh, the church is doing great. Look at all these people coming into the church. I know in my department at Notre Dame, there are many, I don't know, there's maybe a dozen converts to Catholicism in my department. So you can live in a Catholic bubble and think things are going really well. They are not. They're going really poorly. In the Catholic Church in America, again, according to Pew's robust study, there are 6.5 ex-Catholics for every new Catholic. That is not a good ratio. How about for Islam? It is almost exactly the opposite story. Islam is simply flourishing. Now, if you speak to Muslims, they will tell you that Islam is suffering because of Islamophobia. And I don't mean in any way to minimize that. I have Muslim friends who speak to me in a very sincere, authentic way about feeling daily discrimination on the streets of the United States. And that's a real experience. So in certain ways, Islam is in trouble. But in terms of religious affiliation, Islam is simply flourishing in the United States. In 2007, and these numbers are certainly an undercount because many Muslim residents of the United States are not counted. And there's a couple of reasons for that. But in 2007, in the Pew study, Muslims were 0.4%. By 2014, that number had more than doubled to 0.9%. And in a smaller study done by Pew in 2017, they estimated the number at percentage at 1.1%. I'm convinced it's much higher than that. I think it's a major undercount, especially because of the student population and people without papers, without documentation in the United States who wouldn't be counted most likely. But even at that 1.1%, that makes 3.5 million Americans are Muslims. And 23% of these, almost 1/4, are converts. It is not the only reason for Muslim growth in the United States, and I can show that with this nice little chart from Pew. Islam is growing principally because of demographics, that is a higher birth rate. Muslims have a significantly higher birth rate, even than Catholics, and there's still old jokes about Catholics having a lot of kids. And in certain circles, that's obviously the case. We have lots of big vans at my parish. Probably in your parishes, you have some families with big vans to fit all their kids. But the birth rate of Muslims is higher than that of Catholics. And you can see that because you can see that this line of adult Muslims is growing from 1.5 million to 2.15. But this line, which takes in account children, Muslim children, is growing at a higher percentage or to a higher degree. So the Muslim population is a very young population and the birth rate is relatively high. I don't know if this demographic stuff interests you. The birth rate for Muslims in America is certainly lower than it is in the Islamic world. So there is a process of integration and assimilation to social norms in the United States, but the birth rate is still much higher. That has to do with different things that I'm not a sociologist and I probably shouldn't say too much about this, but I would just like to say that parenting in childhood is just, it's an honor in Islamic society in a way that for much of American society, it has become, well, understood differently, sometimes as a burden and a problem. Not always, I don't want to exaggerate, but for Muslims, I mean, to have a baby is just so beautiful. It's so beautiful, and the vocation of parents is cherished. So before I move on and go on to dawah, just to introduce the topic of dawah or evangelism, there is growth in the Islamic community because of conversions as well. Obviously, 1/4 of Muslims are converts. 10% of this 23%, so relatively small, but that would be 2.3% of the American Muslim community is are former Catholics, so almost 100,000, probably about 100,000. So that's a pretty high number. And I made the case in an article I wrote for a journal here at Notre Dame called Church Life Journal that American Catholics should not be worried about being attacked by a jihadi. It's just not, it's not reasonable. You should be worried about dying in a car crash or cancer or something, not being attacked by jihadi. But if you care about the spiritual welfare of Catholics, then maybe you should be worried about conversion to Islam. It is a significant trend, especially, and you'll see this on the next slide. It's a noticeable transformation among Latinos in the United States and Latinas. That was a community that had 10 years ago almost no Muslims, and just in the past 10, 20 years has had a significant growth and a visible growth of Latinos and Latinas, mosques being built in heavily Latino areas throughout the country, and Spanish language resources for Muslims being developed on the internet. So I'll speak about that a little bit more. Okay, so as concerns evangelism and conversion from the Islamic side, I mentioned before the word is dawah. That word literally means invitation. The word dawah comes from the Quran itself. Let me go back a second. I thought I had a different order of the images. Comes from the Quran itself. You'll see a quotation there where God himself commands Muslims to invite people to Islam. There are lots of ways in which dawah takes place. Muslims believe in street dawah. Usually that's in bigger cities like Chicago or New York City. You'll have Muslims on the street now passing out literature. Muslims also are extremely active on the internet, on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and even through public billboard campaigns. And that's the easiest way to share with you. So I thought I would share some of these. These are some billboards from the Islamic Circle of North America, all in the United States. Who is Muhammad, hashtag, and there you have the phone number and the URL. I just find this pretty amazing. There are some evangelical Protestants who do billboard campaigns. At least we see them in Indiana and Illinois around here. But I haven't seen Catholic ones. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe in South Carolina there are. I know there's Catholics Come Home campaign on the radio. I've heard that. But I haven't seen aggressive evangelism from Catholics. Here's another one. Find Jesus in the Quran, Muhammad rather, in the Bible, which you could see is directed at a Christian audience. You can find Jesus in the Quran. You don't have to give up Jesus. But if you actually think about it, you'll see Muhammad in the Bible. We could speak about that. Here is one riffing on Donald Trump's re-election motto, or his initial motto. So there's great sort of acuity or creativeness in making these billboards. Making America Great. You can see the imagery or the iconography is like Trump's campaign material, with love, compassion, and mercy. So Islam is marketed as a religion of love and compassion. How about this? Islam has given us good epidemiological advice. I don't know if you can see this, if my bar is blocking it, on coronavirus, because Muhammad himself advised wash hands, don't leave the infected area, and don't visit an infected area. And then finally, I thought I'd just share an example of a sign in Spanish. This is from New Jersey, which called 877. This is the same Why Islam campaign, advertising you to visit an Islamic educational center. There's a really good resource. Again, I'll share the other resources by email that I've mentioned that are not part of the PowerPoint. But there's a book that's going to come out by my former student at Notre Dame, now a professor at Missouri State, a really great scholar named Matthew Kuyper, who has written the first global history of Dawah, about to be published with Edinburgh Press. Okay, another slide on Dawah, which, as promised, begins with the quotation from the Quran, which has God himself command Muslims to call people to God. That's the same word as Dawah, call people to God. So just as Christians look to the Great Commission and say evangelization is not an option, but a command, so Muslims increasingly look to the Quran and they say the same thing. We are commanded to call people to Islam. Many former Christians have become themselves da'is, so not only converted to Islam, but this is a very important emphasis of Muslims, that when someone converts to Islam, you invite them and encourage them to turn around immediately, because who else would be better to call their former co-religionists to convert as well? This is an old tradition in Islam, that Christians who convert to Islam, they immediately become Muslim evangelists. The Arabic word for evangelist is da'i. So some of the most effective Muslim evangelists are former Christians. This includes a Texan named Yusuf or Joseph Estes, who has a great Texan drawl, but he speaks about Allah and Muhammad with his Texas drawl, and directs his preaching mainly at Christians. Even more influential is someone named Hamza Yusuf, who founded an Islamic college in California known as Zaytuna. He's a really excellent speaker and very learned. Yusuf Estes is more of a popularizer, I would say. Hamza Yusuf is more of an intellectual. And another intellectual, this time in the UK, and convert from Christianity, who is now a very influential da'i, is Tim Winter. I should have given his full name as Timothy. He also has an Islamic name, Abdul Hakim Murad, but he still goes by his birth name of Timothy Winter. Timothy Winter, for example, has begun to write his own hymns, Islamic hymns, using traditional melodies from Christian hymns, but according to Islamic material. Internet is filled with resources to do dawah. I hope it's not getting boring. I'm almost done with the dawah bit, and then we'll get on finally to dialogue of proclamation. But it's filled with resources for dawah. This is a website called Dawah is Easy, has all sorts of videos on how to do dawah. And this is going to be an increasing part of the American religious scene. It will just continue to multiply. It's very visible in big cities, as I've mentioned. It'll begin to become visible everywhere, I assume. And there are also celebrities who have converted to Islam, some of whom you may have heard of. This includes Cat Stevens, who's sort of from our generation. He writes songs only about Islam now. Sinead O'Connor, not sure if you remember her. She was once famous for insulting the Pope on Saturday Night Live, but she has since converted to Islam and put on a hijab. The comedian Dave Chappelle is a convert to Islam. And then the interesting case of Silvia Romano, not really a celebrity, but some of you may have heard that earlier this year, there was an Italian woman who was held in captivity in Eastern Africa for several months by Muslim militants. And the militants preached to her during her time in captivity. They treated her well. They said, we're only doing this to advance our cause and to free some of our fellow fighters who are in prison. They treated her well and they preached Islam to her. They didn't mistreat her, according to her own account. And she embraced Islam and returned to Italy with a headscarf, an Islamic hijab, announcing her conversion to Islam. It was a really big deal in Italy. Okay, so finally, dialogue and proclamation. In light of all of this, conscious of Islam's own missionary impulse, and the church's missionary identity, how do we respond to Islam? Well, Francis makes it pretty clear from the beginning of his pontificate in 2013 that the church is called both to dialogue and to proclamation. He writes, dialogue does not mean, or he spoke at the time, does not mean renouncing one's own identity when it goes against another's, nor does it mean compromising Christian faith and morals. To the contrary, true openness involves remaining steadfast in one's deepest convictions, clear and joyful in one's own identity. This is Francis's own encyclical in Evangelii Gaudium. That's really important. In fact, a dialogue in which the two sides meet in the middle is no longer a dialogue. So true dialogue remains becoming even more firmly rooted in our Christian faith. That's what's interesting. And I've had this conversation with colleagues when we bring in Muslims or Jews or others to give talks here in the theology department at Notre Dame. I'm not interested in a Muslim who's not faithful to his own religion or a Jew who's not. I want to dialogue with someone who is connected to their own community. Otherwise, I'm not dialoguing with Islam. And so the Pope Francis reminds us of that responsibility, that dialogue is, it's not a zero-sum game with a Christian identity. And therefore open understanding the religions of another, capable of respectful human relationship, convinced that the encounter with someone different than ourselves can be an occasion of growth in a spirit of fraternity, of enrichment, and of witness. I'd like to add one more thing, which is a little selfish, but just because I teach at a Catholic university, I make this case with my administration all the time. It's not very easy because there's a lot of forces at Notre Dame that want Notre Dame in different ways to be a little less Catholic. But you know, if Notre Dame is not a place where the church does her thinking, then it cannot add to the diversity of voices in the larger academic world in the United States. It actually renders the greatest service when it's true to its own tradition. Anyway, Francis's address goes on. It is widely thought that coexistence is only possible by hiding one's own religious affiliation, by meeting in a kind of neutral space devoid of references to transcendence. But here too, how would it be possible to create true relationships, to build a society that is a common home, by imposing that each person set aside what he considers to be an intimate part of his very being? Okay, I think it's clear enough. I don't need to comment more on Francis's words. What I like to do as sort of the final step here, and I'll be done in 5 minutes, and then we can have some conversation about this, is to give some examples of Christian exemplars, Catholic Christian exemplars in particular, in their work with Islam. The first is the example of Paolo dell'Olio, someone that I was privileged to know personally. Some of you may have heard his story. In the early 1980s, Paolo dell'Olio established a community at an ancient monastery north of Damascus in Syria, a place called the Monastery of Saint Moses, Der Musa. He actually established a new religious community or new religious congregation, which had a particular vocation to relationships with Muslims. That community still exists today. It's known as the community of El Khalil. They have, with the end of the civil war in Syria, they have returned to the monastery. In 2013, Paolo dell'Olio was taken, had to leave the country, and 2 years later, he returned to Syria in order to negotiate for the release of Christians who had been taken captive by ISIS, and he was never heard from again. There is still some hope out there that he may still be alive. Many people think that he was killed. Paolo dell'Olio is someone who established prayer in a way that was faithful to the church, but also let Muslims feel really comfortable in Christian prayer. The church at his monastery out in the desert was carpeted like a mosque. You removed your sandals or shoes before you entered in. He retrieved those parts of Christian tradition that are similar to Islamic prayer, including, for example, full prostration, pray towards the east, ad orientem, and emphasize the Syriac roots of the church in Syria, which brings it very close to the Arabic roots of Islam. The second example I want to bring up is Josephine Bachita. She has become more and more popular, especially among young people. I find my kids really like her. They think she is awesome. And you may or may not know her story. She, of course, is canonized now, Saint Josephine Bachita. It's just a beautiful story of immense suffering at the hands of Muslims. She, along with her older sister, was captured in a slave raid in the late 19th century in Sudan, and forced to work as a slave, compelled to convert to Islam. And she went through a gruesome procedure of tattooing her body, which I won't describe, with razor blades. That was just horrible. And she has just terrible accounts of the suffering that she received because of the racism of her Turkish and Arab captors, but also because of the hostility towards a non-Muslim who was forcibly converted to Islam. She was eventually ransomed by an Italian diplomat, and as many of you know, brought to Italy, where she converted to Catholicism and dedicated herself to the consecrated life in Venice, and lived a humble life of prayer, and was known for her disposition of charity to everyone, and her ability to forgive even her captors in the Sudan. So just to return to Pope Francis before one final example of a saint, the spirit of Josephine Bachita invites us, even in light of the suffering that the church has had at different times at the hand of Muslims, to find what is best in Muslims. For example, to emphasize what I started speaking about in the first lecture, the mercifulness of God in the Quran and how important divine mercy is to Muslims. In fact, there's even something we can learn from that, from this dependence on God that Muslims show, that can be exemplary even for Christians. And in the document on human fraternity, co-signed by Pope Francis and Ahmed al-Tayyib, they both encourage us to see what is best in the other. Faith leads a believer to see in the other a brother or sister to be supported and loved. Through faith in God who has created the universe, creatures and all human beings, equal on account of his mercy, believers are called to express his human fraternity by safeguarding creation and the entire universe. Final example of someone who saw the best in Islam, and then I will shut up, I promise, is Blessed Charles de Foucauld. An amazing story, amazing man, and one of my personal heroes. I feel like a lot of Catholics have like their top 3 or top 5 list of saints, and it sort of shifts around like the rankings in college football. Won't say anything about the game. So Blessed Charles de Foucauld is up there for me, although he's not yet canonized. But Charles de Foucauld is a man who dedicated his life to living out the hidden life of Christ, the poor carpenter in Nazareth, the ultimate humility and emptying of God in Christ, who lived as a poor man. And he lived as a hermit in Algeria for the latter part of his life around Muslims. In fact, there were no Christians around him. He only made one convert during, I don't know, several decades in the Saharan desert. But he continually prayed for the conversion of Muslims. And he encouraged many people to return to their Catholic faith at a time when France, which is certainly still the case, was increasingly becoming secular and moving away from its Catholic roots. In a letter to a great scholar, another Catholic scholar of Islam, maybe the greatest Catholic scholar of Islam in the 20th century, named Louis Massignon, in the midst of World War I, when Massignon was serving as an officer in the French army, he wrote the following, and I'll leave you with this. We must never hesitate to ask for those posts where the danger, sacrifice, and devotion are greatest. Honor, let us leave that to whoever wishes it, but danger, difficulty, let us always claim them. Christians, we should provide an example of sacrifice and devotion. Our corner of the Sahara is at peace. I pray for you with all my heart, and at the same time for your household. This will reach you around Christmas and January 1. Look for me to be very near you on those 2 days. A happy and holy year. May God keep you and protect France. We could substitute the United States. May Jesus, Mary, and Joseph keep you with them your whole earthly life at the hour of your death and through eternity. Thank you. I think you may need to unmute. Sorry, John.
One question that came up during the break was how, like you talked about how in the Muslims, they say that Christ wasn't, he didn't die. He was just brought right up into heaven. But yet that's not what the Gospels say. So how does that, how do they answer that it's so different?
Don, you want me to expand on that?
Yeah, that'd be fine.
Okay, it's Deacon Andy again from the Myrtle Beach Deanery, Gabriel.
Hello.
Question I had was, you talked about how the crucifixion was fiction. And the question I had was, how do they see the source and summit of our life, which is the Eucharist? How Christ said to do this in remembrance of me. Do they even comment on that?
Yeah, really important. So I'll start with the crucifixion and then turn to the Eucharist. In terms of the crucifixion, I mean, this is a real problem for Muslims to explain, in my humble opinion. I mean, Christians have difficult issues in their discussion with Muslims, speaking about the Trinity or the Incarnation can be difficult. For Muslims, the crucifixion can be difficult. The typical Islamic story is that God actually changed someone else into the form of Jesus, and that other person was crucified in his place. So this does not have good historical grounding. The denial of the crucifixion of Christ, even non-Christian historians would generally say the crucifixion is one of the few things we can be sure of. So there are Muslims who will deny. The Quran is not really explicit that that's what took place. It definitely denies that the Jews crucified Jesus. But Islamic tradition, including hadith attributed to Muhammad, say that Jesus wasn't crucified at all. Some Muslims will say that simply that that's wrong, that he was crucified, because it's really difficult to explain a denial of the crucifixion. In terms of the Eucharist, right, even though in my humble opinion, the Quran has a clear allusion to the Eucharist in that passage I shared with you at the end of Quran chapter 5, verse 114, I think it's pretty clear there. That's not understood by the Muslim commentators as a reference to the Eucharist. It's just seen as a miracle. And Muslims would say prayer is meant to be just a ritual, what Muslims call salat. So the ritual prayer that Muslims do, that is a series of prostrations and recitation of certain formulas. I found that when Muslim friends have visited Mass, that they found it, some just have great charity. And I mean, we shouldn't underestimate the charity of Muslims and genuine interest in Christianity and sympathy. So I've had some Muslims who have said, that's really beautiful. I remember one Muslim friend when I was in college came with me to Mass, and he was like, the singing was just beautiful. And I thought, gosh, Catholics are always complaining about the singing, and this Muslim guy liked it. But I've also had Muslims say, what the heck is going on with the Eucharist especially? But this is so unlike Muslim prayer that they found it, at least I can think of one case at one of my children's first communions, a Muslim family who came just found it really strange and foreign.
Just a comment on your last section too is, I met Our Lady Star to see in North Myrtle Beach. Traditionally, in the summertime, we've had maybe 1,400 to 1,600 people at most of the masses. This past summer, 150 to 200 people. So the Catholic faith to me is taking a beating right now. And it seems like our government is just trying to get rid of it completely. We have no help from them at all. We're still at 25%, but we have good reason because the hospital not too far from us is experiencing the last 2 weeks a rise in the COVID virus down there. And I'm aware of our pastor even anointing some that have died. But even when we still carry on prayer and benediction, evening prayer and benediction. And there have been times in the past when maybe there were 100 people, and now we're lucky if we have 10. So I think we're going through a trying time, but I don't think it's a time when we should stop. stop the prayer. I think we have to continue.
Thank you.
Hello?
Any other questions? Yes, go ahead.
This is Deacon Jim. And the one thing regarding missionary activity, I had an occasion to speak with the missionary priest who worked in Islamic areas. And he felt that the key to cooperation is missionary activity. But getting back to my question, I have a very close friend, Muslim, and he carries with him at all times a little knife. It's got like a little curved handle. And he told me that he carries this with him as a reminder to always seek the peaceful path. And it reminds him always of the harm that one can do. So now I take that, and I'm going to have three different ideas here, trying to mesh them into one. We look at Ignatius, and Ignatius teaches us about the battle and the internal struggle, and that the devil will always try to take our strengths or our weaknesses and use them. Much like, let's say, a person who takes it upon themselves to murder an abortion provider. The devil has taken his strength and has used it against him that he commits a horrible act. We take this on a broader scale and we look at the jihad, the holy war, and we take Ignatius' words, and Ignatius' words said that the battle is within our own hearts and our own minds, and that we need to discern. And it seems to me that this jihad, whereby you'll have militant Muslims, are being taken by the devil down the wrong path. The strength of their faith, their love for their faith, their love for Allah is being used against them by the devil to go out and to kill human beings. Am I right on that? Do you have anything to offer on that? Or can you clear up something on my thinking? I know it's not exactly clear, but it's kind of like always follow the pathway to peace, in contrast with that jihad, and instead of the battle being fought in my heart to walk toward peace, I'm being used by the devil to commit evil. Kind of
Deacon
complicated.
Jim, let
Yeah.
him answer.
Oh, no, I'm done. Yeah, I'm
Okay.
done. I'm done.
Yeah, it was a really interesting reflection. Thank you, Deacon. Yeah, I don't exclude the working of the devil. I mean, we're taught by our faith in our church to be on our guard against the devil, who's prowling like a roaring lion, ready to devour. And so I don't exclude that possibility. I think that it's very complicated to speak about incidents of violence because it's just not, as you know, I mean, for the example of a murder of an abortion provider, or for that matter, someone who procures an abortion. It's just so complicated in every individual case. Take as an example, I won't go on forever, but take as an example the situation in Pakistan, which has blasphemy laws. And there are mobs which will form very quickly and without any process, they'll lynch someone accused of blasphemy. It happened recently, just 2 days ago, was a Muslim who was killed, I believe. This is like mob rule and logic that overwhelms people. They're not reading the hadith and then thinking, oh, let me go out in the street now. They're taken up in the passion and violence of a mob. You know, I'm really not qualified to speak about this, but I only assume that, you know, women who procure an abortion, There are all sorts of complicated factors sometimes, and other people are complicit in the sin of abortion. Sometimes their boyfriends or husbands. And so it's very complicated. I don't exclude the possibility that our enemy is also active in different ways through that process.
Yeah, thank you. I think when I look at my friend who carries that little knife, it's always don't act spontaneously, such as gathering into a mob. But the key there is discernment. And who is it that's speaking to me? Is it God that's speaking to me? Is it the devil that's trying to use my strength in an evil way? And that time to take the discernment.
Yeah. And I see your reference.
I have a
wisdom of
hard time
referring to Ignatius.
articulating.
Sorry, I missed that last point.
I said I get carried away because I have a hard time getting to the point and articulating. I'm thinking as I'm talking.
Oh no, it was
The
very
idea
clear.
is not clear.
It was clear, and you're right to refer to Ignatius, who I think can be a really good guide in these times and these complicated questions. The very patient discernment as we think through these very difficult issues. Yeah, and attentiveness to the spirits, good and bad, who exert a certain influence on us.
Professor, this is Deacon Andrew in Rock Hill.
Hey, Deacon Andrew.
You have made a comment before that it is more logical to be hit by a car than it is to be attacked by jihadis. I'm not going to dispute that you may be right, but I think maybe here in the US, if you look in other countries, such as the Middle East, especially Saudi Arabia, I have many friends who are stationed there and in Kuwait and different Middle Eastern countries. It's against the law to even carry a cross around your neck, to even have a Bible. They call it witchcraft, a book of witchcraft, if you have a Bible. I have, like I said, many friends who are Muslim, and in the Charlotte area in North Carolina, there's a large mosque, and I've been there, I've prayed with them. I find that although their faith is very simple in one way, and it's a two-sided coin, and everybody knows, right and wrong, and perhaps simple and hard on another side, but everybody forgets there's three sides to a coin, that edge. On that edge, Professor, would you say that is where, like Our Lady of Fatima, being Portuguese, I have a great devotion to Our Lady of Fatima, and she's named Fatima, the village, is named after the favorite daughter of Muhammad. Many people don't know that. And there is a folklore in that area that Islam will be converted through the Virgin Mary. And for them, as you showed all these pictures of, billboards and the dawah, or I don't know if I'm saying that correctly, it is.
Hey, Andrew, are you going to change your name to James?
Maybe. Sorry, the question is, how do we as Catholics grow to bringing Muslims into our faith and seeing more akin, that we're more alike than we are dislike?
Yeah.
The first thing we have to do is to teach them Portuguese.
Food. I know food always works. They don't like chorizo though.
So much for your time, for your energy, for all your patience. I suggest that anyone who has any more question for the professor can send an email to me, and I'll forward it to the professor. And that would be an easier way to do it. Okay. I appreciate your knowledge. Very interesting, very fascinating. It's sad that we're losing some Catholic, but we have lost them. We have lost them for another reason too. So I thank you, and may God continue to bless you in your ministry.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all of the deacons. I'm so grateful from the bottom of my heart for what you do for the church. And as I mentioned before, I think you are the unsung heroes of the church. And that's what makes your service all the more beautiful.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.